In the fourth and final instalment of our series on the Covenanters, we're going to meet the man remembered by the monument behind me.
A figure who, despite his youth, held up the flag of the covenant, even as he was chased and pursued by a government who despised him and his message.
James Renwick was born here in the village of Moniaive in Galloway, southwestern Scotland. His parents, Andrew and Elizabeth Renwick, were not rich. They had had several children, all of whom had died in infancy. James's mother, heartbroken by loss, was spurred on to pray for a child who might survive and live before the Lord. Like Hannah in the Bible, she prayed for a son, and when the Lord granted her prayer, she was equally prayerful that the boy might be used to build up the kingdom of Christ. Think for a moment about James's parents. They lived in evil days, days of great uncertainty for those who held that Christ alone should rule in his church. Charles II was back on the throne, and it was becoming clear that he would not uphold Scotland's covenant, and, to the contrary, would use the apparatus of the state to put down those who prized the covenant. When James Renwick was born, it was just 8 months since James Guthrie's execution at Edinburgh's Market Cross. Young Renwick was born into a troubled world indeed. Elizabeth Renwick was encouraged to see early signs of piety in her boy. At just 2 years of age, he was observed to be praying, but all was not plain sailing. In his youth, James had grave doubts about the truth of the Christian faith.
On one occasion, being in the fields, he looked up at the mountains and said that if these were all devouring furnaces of burning brimstone, he would be content to go through them all, if by so doing he could be assured that there was a God. Renwick knew what it was to doubt. But he worked through his heart questionings, and in time he was assured in his faith that there was a God, and that, through believing in Jesus Christ his Son, he was in right relationship with this God.
By the time he finished his studies in Edinburgh, James was a God-fearing man who was aligning himself more and more with the cause of the covenant. Seeing the Covenanter Donald Cargill publicly executed on July the 27th, 1681, moved him profoundly. In time, he was to see his own work as an extension of Cargill's and others' suffering for the truth. One of the first fruits of James Renwick's ministry was a discourse he gave in October of 1681, he was just 19, in which he shared how grieved he was by the compromise in the Church of Scotland. Many professing Christians, out of fear and a desire for easy peace, accepted the king's claim to universal authority. Many of them defended paying the cess or tax which would be used by the government to persecute Christians unwilling to comply with its demands. Renwick stood against such compromise. Around the same time, he began collecting testimonies of the suffering Covenanters, and in what he styled his first public action, he organised Edinburgh Covenanters to take down and bury the bodies of 5 martyrs who had been executed for their opposition to the king.
The 1680s saw some of the most extreme persecution that the Covenanters had yet endured. Indeed, this period would be styled the killing time. Estates were confiscated, arrests made, and dragoons were told to show no mercy. Many Covenanters were gunned down without trial if they didn't satisfy the king's troops as to their loyalty. At the same time, the government sought to encourage seeds of bitterness in the Covenanting movement, and used various means to flatter, bribe, and divide them.
At such a time, the movement needed leaders, and young James Renwick would prove to be both a figurehead and a lightning rod. He would inspire many and also provide a public target for the government's hatred and fury. But he was more than that. He was someone who was able to pastor the scattered sheep of the remnant of the Church of Scotland and provide intellectual leadership. The public square of Sanquhar in Nithsdale witnessed a number of key declarations made by the Covenanters. James Renwick was among those who declared against the government and against those who were aiding and abetting the government by providing information in the so-called Apologetical Declaration of 1684, and it would have been promulgated here in Sanquhar as well as in other places. There they confessed their continued adherence to their covenants and engagements. Bolder still, they state that they have, quote, disowned the authority of Charles Stuart, although not the authority of God's institutions. And they have forsworn all authority depending on Charles Stuart. And for reasons given elsewhere, they say, we have declared war against him and his accomplices, such as lay themselves out to promote his hellish and wicked designs. The language of declaring war on a sovereign ruler may seem extreme to us, but at this point it was a defensive war, one that was fought primarily with words, although they were ready also to take up arms in extremity. All of this, however, lay still in the future. Renwick was encouraged to go to Holland to study, where many Covenanters had fled to escape the king's wrath. While in Holland, he was ordained to the church's ministry, but he pined for his poor, persecuted Scotland. Returning in 1683, Renwick began a remarkable 5-year stint of itinerant ministry. His flock were the so-called scattered remnant, which held fast to the covenant of 1638. They opposed the king's right to rule in the Church of Christ, and they defied the laws and declarations outlawing the conventicles, the outdoor meetings. Of course, these Christians often had nowhere to meet but outdoors, since the government had tamed or turned out every gospel minister who believed that the church should be independent of the crown. Renwick became pastor and apostle to this remnant. He preached on moor, on mountain, in fields, and beside fountains. He preached the good news about Jesus Christ, baptized children, administered the Lord's Supper, and offered counsel and support to the persecuted flock of Christ. The Lord's presence was tangible at many of the outdoor meetings. Renwick speaks of the conventicles being signally countenanced of the Lord. Meanwhile, the government offered a £100 reward, about £20,000 in today's inflated currency, for the capture, dead or alive, of Renwick and some associates. He had a number of close escapes from the king's men. On one occasion, he was pursued by dragoons and had to hide for hours in a slight depression on Dungavel Hill. The Lord delivered him on this and many other occasions, but Renwick accepted that one day the day would come for him to seal his own testimony with his blood. After the government's third proclamation against him, he remarked, "There is now strange thirsting after my blood, but that moves me not." The threat of capture and execution was real, and Renwick would later confess that at times he was gripped by the fear of the treatment that almost certainly awaited him. But state violence was not his only challenge. Renwick was slight in build and not strong. His work demanded much of him, physically, mentally, and spiritually, quite apart from the trying circumstances in which he was forced to conduct it. Sleepless nights and foul weather took a toll on his health, reducing him at times to fainting fits. Harder still was the opposition and suspicion he aroused, even in fellow Christians. This suffering servant of Christ was distrusted by some and slandered by others. His faithfulness and directness in witnessing against the sins of the day made those who had already compromised prone to writing him off as a poor, blown-up, illiterate person who, with 100 silly, poor, daft bodies, went about the country robbing people. Renwick, along with his associates, drafted careful replies to some of these public accusations, but others had simply to be ignored and endured. To the true servant of Christ, the varied praise and criticism of men must often be matters of indifference. Renwick was bold enough to venture into the capital itself. And it was here, just down the street from the castle, on the 1st of February 1688, that Renwick was captured. His voice was overheard, his identity was guessed, and a party of excisemen were dispatched to arrest him and claim the bounty that was on his head.
At first, Renwick ran, but being struck in the chest, he eventually fell and was captured.
He was brought to Patrick Graham, captain of the guard, who exclaimed, "What? Is this boy Mr. Renwick, that the nation hath been so much troubled with?" Scotland's last great covenanting leader had been captured. At Renwick's trial, held a week later, he was charged with disowning the king's authority, calling him a usurper and a tyrant, for preaching that it was unlawful to pay the tax expressly exacted for bearing down the gospel, and for teaching that it was lawful for people to bear defensive arms when the government persecuted them with violence. It was unnecessary to call any further witnesses. Renwick admitted all 3 charges, objecting only when the court described him as having cast off the fear of God. "That," he said, "I deny, for it is because I fear to offend God and violate his law that I am here, standing ready to be condemned." Sentenced to death, Renwick remained some days in prison, where the authorities put pressure on him to recant his faith. Cowardly and calculating, Renwick's accusers knew that another high-profile execution would not help the king's cause. But Renwick stood firm. He would not budge in the slightest or do anything that would undermine the cause of Scotland's covenanted work of reformation. The night before his execution, he wrote a testimony to his Christian friends. "God," he wrote, "has strengthened me to brave man and face death, and I am now longing for the joyful hour of my dissolution, and there is nothing in the world that I am sorry to leave but you. But I go to better company, and so I must take my leave of you." On the morning of 17th of February 1688, James Renwick ate for the last time with his mother and sisters. He testified to the help he had received in his imprisonment from the Lord. "I may say I never had the fear of death since I came to this prison, but from the place where I was taken, I could have gone very composedly to the scaffold. Oh, how can I contain this, to be within 2 hours of the crown of glory?" Renwick was taken to the Grassmarket under Edinburgh Castle, where over 100 of his fellow Covenanters had already suffered to the death. The soldiers drummed loudly, as the authorities were loath to let him speak from the scaffold, as so many Covenanters had movingly done. Notwithstanding the noise, he blessed the Lord, singing from Psalm 103 and reading from Revelation chapter 19. Disturbed in prayer by the loud drumming, he declared, "I shall soon be above these clouds. Then shall I enjoy thee and glorify thee without interruption or intermission forever." Climbing up the scaffold, he was heard to say, "Lord, I die in the faith that thou wilt not leave Scotland, but that thou wilt make the blood of thy witnesses the seed of thy church, and return again and be glorious in our land. And now, Lord, I am ready. The bride, the Lamb's wife, hath made herself ready." So it was that James Renwick, the last of the prominent Covenanter martyrs, laid down his life for the Lord he loved above everything, and for his Lord's cause in Scotland. Within a year, James, the Duke of York, had been chased from the throne, and the barbaric persecution of the Covenanters, which had lasted so many years, was finally brought to an end.
The Covenanters, though they died, yet they still speak today. They remind us that all earthly power has necessary limits. They remind us that there is one King, the King of Kings, who rules in his church and will one day rule the nations. And they show us, by their love for and service to the Lord Jesus Christ, a way to live that is profoundly out of sync with the manner of life of the world around us. And so the question is, where is our ultimate allegiance? Is it to this world and to its powers, or is it to the Lord Jesus Christ? And that's the question they pose to us. Who will we follow?
So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory, beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal.